We're going to learn with Damian Hughes, Professor Damian Hughes, to explore the winning mindset based on the STEPS process. He's going to be talking about that in detail. We're going to learn to ask the question, not how intelligent are we, but how are we intelligent? That's another interesting thing we're going to talk about. And we're going to learn why certain stories and ideas stick in our mind and others don't. Please welcome with a huge round of applause, Professor Damian Hughes.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hi. Let me explain who I am, because it'll help you make sense of the context for this session. My name's Damian Hughes. I do three roles. The main one is I'm a professor of psychology at the University in Manchester. My specialism is in organisational psychology and change. I also work as a consultant psychologist across a wide range of different organisations, from the corporate world through to education, but mainly my work takes me into the world of elite sport. So working with coaches across a diverse range of sports, looking at how they can introduce some of these ideas into their world. The third role I do, and this is what I want to share with you today, is that I'm an author. I've written a number of books very much around these topics. And I wanted to share with you some of the research around this particular book, A Winning Mindset. 5 years ago, a publisher asked me if I would be interested in spending 2 years travelling around the world interviewing elite sports coaches. Not from the perspective of what do these coaches do in terms of the sports, but how do they do it? How do they get a diverse collection of individuals to behave in a cohesive manner? How do they deliver a message that people will remember long after they've executed it? How do they teach people the skills of performing under pressure? All the challenges that are common to all our worlds. My role was to find out how do they do it in a world where everything seems to be amplified and speeded up. So what I'd like to do is, in the next hour, is share with you some of those insights and give you some ideas about how they can relate to your world as well. So if I may, I'll start at the start of the journey. The first coach that I went to meet was a fascinating man, a man called Freddie Roach. He's a boxing coach that's based out in Los Angeles. Now, the reason Freddie Roach is such a fascinating figure to me is that not only has he been incredibly successful in terms of the way that he coaches athletes, but he's also done it while struggling with the impact of Parkinson's disease. Now, the Parkinson's has had a significant impact on two aspects of his life. One is the physical manifestations, where he often shakes uncontrollably. But the second aspect is in the way that he speaks. So it's impacted on his speech, which is often slurred and quite difficult to comprehend. And yet, despite this is a guy that's consistently coached athletes to deliver sustained high performance. So when I went to interview him, the essence of my question was, how do you do what you do? And after a while of trying to explain it, he said, you know what, it's probably easier if I can illustrate it rather than explain it. And I said, please do. So he gave me a piece of paper and a pen, and he asked me to draw a picture. Now, I was wondering, would you like to start this afternoon's session by doing the same exercise that I did that morning in Los Angeles? Do you want to draw a picture for me? Yeah. Don't kill me with your enthusiasm levels, right? Would you like to draw a picture? Yeah. Get a piece of paper and a pen, and you'll do the same task. So, the challenge that I was issued was this one. He asked me to draw a cup. Draw a mug or a coffee cup, however you want to describe it. I'm going to give you 20 seconds to draw your best version of that. Can you do that for me? Give you 20 seconds to draw your best interpretation. When you've done it, I'd like you to share it with the person you're sat next to. Have a look at what you've just achieved. Can I have a look at yours? They're great. Very impressive. Okay, right. So, thank you for indulging me in that exercise. Now, apart from establishing that artistic talent isn't necessarily a prerequisite to attend the conference, what I've just seen from certainly some of those of you at the front, your version of that task is remarkably similar to my own. This is the version that I came up with. Now, what I would ask you to do is hold on to that picture for me, because I will show you how it took me 2 years of research to recognise why that was a fantastic metaphor when it comes to coaching. It took me a while to realise it, and I'll come back and I'll explain why in a moment. So what did I learn? Well, what I found was, if you want to improve engagement in any community that you're driving, there are 5 things that psychologically have to be present, and this is what I witnessed over and over again from the coaches that I work with. Now, to make it easy for you to remember, I've given it the acronym of STEPS, but what I'd like to do is take you through each of the steps in turn and explain a little bit more about why they're important when it comes to coaching for improved performance. So we will start with the first and most obvious of the steps, which is this. Our brains are wired for simplicity. Our brains need to have things explained in the simplest possible terms. And yet we live in a world that makes that increasingly difficult to deliver. Let me give you a statistic that's worth reflecting on. In the next hour that we spend in each other's company, you're going to be interrupted, on average, 37 times during that period by the device that's sitting in your pocket. Whether that's the form of a phone call, an email, social media demanding your attention, you're going to be interrupted 37 times in the next 60 minutes. If you allow yourself to respond to just one of those 37 distractions, what we know is it will take you on average 22 minutes to get your levels of concentration back to the place it was when you first walked into this room. So the essence of our point is this: smart technology is making us stupid in lots and lots of different ways. Now, the medical dictionaries are having to rewrite themselves rapidly to cope with the rise of technology that's impacting on the software that sits between our ears. We know, for example, that we've identified a new phobia over the last decade known as nomophobia, which is the terror you get when you leave your phone down and then can't remember where you left it. There's another condition that's known as ADT, attention deficit trait. Now, that's different from attention deficit disorder. That's a neurological condition. Attention deficit trait suggests that in the middle of your working day, when you're rushing from one activity to another, when your phone is ringing, email is pinging, people are asking you for 2 minutes of your time, you're thinking about the agenda of the next meeting you walk into, your IQ levels will diminish on average by between 15 and 20 points. And they stay at those depleted levels until you have space and time to think. Now, let's view this through the eyes of the people that you're trying to engage, because the impact is just as significant. John Cotter, the Harvard psychologist, suggests that for an employee in the Western world, you receive on average 2.3 million bits of data from your organisation direct to your head in a 3-month period. Whether that 3-month period it involves newsletters, emails, team briefs, company conferences, you receive on average 2.3 million bits of data per quarter. What percentage of that 2.3 million bits of information do you think ever centres around one simple, single, coherent, consistent message? Any estimates? The evidence suggests it's around 13,400. In percentage terms, just over 0.5% of the information that you're being subjected to by an organisation direct to you ever reminds you of the main purpose of your role, of your organisation's role in that. So we understand that in a world of noise, the ability to communicate in the simplest terms becomes increasingly important, and it's a skill that we often overlook. Now, one of the coaches I interviewed in the course of the research was Sir Alex Ferguson at Manchester United. And the question I asked him was, in his world, the hype and the noise seems to be at an already excruciating level. And I said, how do you cut through that noise? And again, similar to Freddie Roach in Los Angeles, he said, let me illustrate it rather than explain it. So I was in his office and he said to me, stand up. And when I stood opposite him, he took a tennis ball and he threw it to me. He said, catch that. I managed to catch it. It was a simple task. He said, how did you find it? I said, it was easy. Why? He said, give it me back. When I handed it him back, he took 2 tennis balls and threw them in the air at the same time with the instruction to catch them both. Now, I managed to do it. He said, how did you find that exercise? I said, it was a little bit harder. I had to focus a little bit more. He said, true, give it back. Then he threw 3 tennis balls in the air. Then he threw 4. And on the final occasion, he threw 5 balls in the air at the same time with the instruction to catch them all. And on that final occasion, I did well to catch 1. Ferguson's answer was, that is the difference between a good and a great coach. Because what a good coach tries to do is to give you all the answers that you need. They try to cover every possible mitigating circumstance that you might face. He said, but great coaches don't. They start from the perspective of not how many balls can I throw, but from the understanding, how many balls can you easily catch? And this is the point that we get to when it comes to simplicity. It's about how are you able to communicate in the purest possible terms. Now, for those of you that are worried about this being too sports-oriented, it's not. I'm talking about people that just happen to work within that industry. But to illustrate the point, this was brought home really neatly that when I was out in the States, I interviewed some organisational psychologists from Stanford University that were doing a similar project to me, but in a completely different industry. Their world was Hollywood. And what they were looking at was, how does a writer in Hollywood get an idea from out of their head onto the screen of your cinema? How does that process work? And what they found was similar to me that I was discovering with the world of great coaches. It wasn't the most talented, it wasn't the most creative, it wasn't the ones that had access to the best resources. The ones that had a consistent track record of success were the ones that were able to communicate simply. And the acronym that they came up with in their research in Hollywood was, the best writers could bluff. And the bluff in their case stood for, whenever they communicated, they would give you the bottom line up front. They would bluff the bottom line up front. Now, I thought we'd have some fun with this, and I thought I'd show you what some genuine bluffs look like in Hollywood and see if you can guess the films that were made as a result of it. Would you like to try this? Yeah. Again, don't kill me with those enthusiasm levels, right? Would you like to try it? Yeah! That's a bit better, right. Just shout out if you know what this film is then. Any guesses? Good guess. Try this one. Which is 25 years old this year, if you want to feel old. Try this one. Zorro. No. Not quite, is it? There's a really nice story about this that Steven Spielberg tells in an interview. He said that he'd been rejected from making a James Bond film. It was the film Octopussy in the 1970s. And he was upset about his rejection. And he was on holiday with his friend George Lucas, and he was telling him about his rejection. And George Lucas suggested, he said, I've got a better idea. He said, well, why don't we remake James Bond himself, but give him just a hat and a whip? And they took just that one sentence, they had no more detail than that, pitched it to Hollywood, and the whole trilogy was subsequently greenlit. Now, what I love about Hollywood is some films don't even bother to change their bluff title when it comes to introducing it to the general public. Now, you can't complain you didn't know what that film was about, could you? Right? They've told you before you even go in. Now, this isn't to suggest that people are stupid, it's the opposite. Leonardo da Vinci gave you a great quote. Simplicity is the ultimate in sophistication. People are smart, your job is just to give them the information in a way that smart people can receive and therefore respond to. And I thought we would illustrate this point neatly by continuing this Hollywood theme. And I will show you that I will give you some really simple information for you to digest, and then we will show you how we will create a consensus here in this room, just on the basis that you're intelligent people being given simple information. Let me explain. Let's imagine that our task this afternoon is to make a movie. What's the movie about, you ask me? I don't know. I can only give you 5 words that describe what the film is going to be based on. And then the 5 words I can give you is this: Die Hard on a Plane. That's all I know. We will come up with a better title nearer to the production. But let's have a look at it through the eyes of these different stakeholders that we need to engage to help us make this movie become a reality. So we will start by talking to the finance people. They need to help us raise a budget. So if you're working on a movie that the working title is Die Hard on a Plane, do you think you need to raise around $10 million to make this movie happen? Or do you think it's more likely it's going to be $100 million. So let's take a vote. Who thinks we're going to have to raise around $10 million to make this movie come alive? Okay, about a fifth of us. Who thinks it's more likely to be in the $100 million region? Right. So automatically we've got a consensus here in the room, and all I've been able to communicate is that working title. So let's look at it from HR's point of view, because they need to recruit actors to make this film come alive. So do you think we need a superstar to carry this movie and get it greenlit? Or do you think we could get away with an ensemble cast of unknown actors instead? So who thinks it's the ensemble option? Who thinks we have to go down the superstar route? And again, we have a consensus.
They should die.
We've got to get the marketeers now involved. So do you think we need action or drama specialists? You tell me. And we laugh at how ridiculous the question is. But the question we need to understand is, why is it such an obvious question? And the reason is because we've been able to communicate in the simplest possible terms. You're smart people, so when you can receive it, you can automatically make smart decisions. So one of the principles in any of our world is, do you know what the one simple message you want people to understand is? Are you clear about how many tennis balls you're throwing when you're coaching? Or are you more interested in how many they can catch? Because what it does is it brings us to this second element of what I saw these coaches do. And this is the element that was the quietest of all the skills. It was the ability to get people to think. Let me explain why. You're required to make, on average, around 10,000 decisions every single day. We know that out of the 10,000 decisions that you make on a daily basis, about 236 of them are just around the food and drink that you will consume during that day. And if you don't believe me, just take a moment and think about your visit to any coffee shop, anywhere on any high street in the world. You think about the amount of decisions that you have to make from the moment you walk in through those doors to actually leaving there with a coffee in your hands. Because it's not as simple as merely asking for one. When you first walk in, they want to know what size cup would you like. Once you've established that, they want to know what type of bean do you favour. Once you've decided that, they want to know is there a style of coffee you would prefer. Once you've got through that hurdle, they want to know, do you want milk? And if you do you want it to be skim, semi or full fat? Then you have to decide, are you going to flavour it? How many sugars, if so, or how many sweeteners are you going to use? So you start to add up the cumulative effect of those amount of decisions, and you start to realise how our brains can't cope with the demands that the modern world places on it. So what we've done instead, psychologically, is we've adopted a series of heuristics, mental models, that allow us to navigate our way through a day without having to stop and think and reflect. Now, the vast majority of these mental models are our friend. They allow us to navigate our way through a day without having to stop and procrastinate and deliberate at every small event. You can walk into a room and flick a light switch. You don't gasp every time electricity works. You can turn a tap in a bathroom. You don't wonder where the water flows from because you have a mental model that assumes that that's the way the world works. But when you're asking people to do something different than what they did yesterday, that's when these mental models become your biggest problem, because people don't like thinking about it. So when you are coaching people and you hear them say, things are different, it's not as good as it used to be, back in the day things were a lot better, what you're hearing is the moment that they actually stop thinking. They're telling you the moment they stop thinking, and what you're forcing them to do is to engage in it, and our brains don't like doing so. We know, for example, it takes you 5 times more energy to think about thinking than it does just to go through the same routines over and over. Think about it in your lives. When was the last time you changed your high street bank? Now, for most of us, we decided on it a long time ago, and we've just kept loyalty to the same bank ever since. And when we justify it in our minds, we say, they're all the same. There's no point. There's no real difference. But the reality is, it's just that our brains don't like to invest the energy in thinking about whether we are working with the right bank for us. So we find excuses to keep ourselves in the same loops over and over again. So this is the bit that I found these coaches would obsess over. They didn't concern themselves with having the right answer to every question they would possibly face. But what they did seem to be particularly obsessed about was creating an environment where people would still ask you questions. And if you want a barometer of how effective your work is, simply take a moment and have a look at how many people are asking you questions or giving you feedback. Because when somebody asks a question, there's two things that are happening psychologically under the surface of that relationship that have to be there if thinking and therefore learning is going to take place. When somebody asks you a question, the first thing that they're demonstrating in that environment is that psychological safety is present. I have to be psychologically safe enough to put my hand up and admit, I don't know, I'm not sure, I need more information, can you help me? And I need to feel safe enough that nobody's going to make me feel foolish, or I'm going to look stupid, or I'm going to be exposed or punished for not having the answers. The second thing that is happening when somebody puts their hand up and asks you a question is also they're demonstrating trust. They're giving you trust in that relationship that you are going to handle that query in a respectful, discreet and sensitive manner. And if either of those two elements are not present, learning cannot happen. So this is one of the things that I found these coaches would obsess about. They would jump on any question that was asked and treat it with real respect, however stupid the question might have appeared to be. They had the idea that they needed to use it as an opportunity to build trust that would lead to greater learning further on in the relationship. We see this with the work at university in Manchester. We see this when we work with teachers. We've found evidence that says if you're a teacher and you just tell the children what they need to study and how they need to learn it, they can cram the information into their short-term memory for an exam. When you go back 6 months later and ask them how much information they've retained, it's less than 5%. So the point we make to teachers is, if you're only thinking that your job is to dispense information, Google has already beaten you to the punch. The children can get the same information online. What Google can't deliver for those children is passion, energy, curiosity, enthusiasm for the topic. And if you can generate those kind of emotions with your students, we've demonstrated you can retain up to 75% of the information 6 months later. So our job as coaches is to create that environment where psychological safety and trust exists, because that's where curiosity and therefore learning will follow. Now I thought I'd demonstrate it, and I thought we'd play a bit of a game here and show you how if I get you to think about what I'm getting you to do, we will instantly make your retention, the ability to recall information, improve like that. Would you like to try it? Do you want to try a game that we'll play? Yeah. Yay, that's better, right. It's a game, I don't know how far this travelled across Europe, but in the UK, there used to be a game called the Generation Game. I don't know if you remember it. You ever see it? No. So on UK TV, it was around for about 30 years. So the host would change regularly, but the format of the show never did. And what they would have was a conveyor belt where they would put information across the conveyor belt. And your job was to read out the name of every item as it appeared on the belt. Then, when all 21 items have appeared, you have to work as a pair to recall as many of those items as you possibly can. Are you clear what you're going to do? Yes? So I'm going to put 21 items on this conveyor belt. Your job is read out the name of every item as it appears. When all 21 have appeared, you are going to work in pairs to remember, and you're going to get 20 seconds to remember as many as you can. Clear what we're doing there? Any questions? Now let me tell you where the problem is. I'm going to introduce a problem to this that is going to force you to think. I'm not going to give you all 21 items. The name of every item will be there, but on some occasions the image is going to be obscured. On some of the occasions the image is not even there. Don't worry about that. Read out the name of every item as it comes across. I will show you how this instantly makes you smarter. Are you clear what you're doing? Any questions? No. Are you ready to read them out loud? Yeah. Should we get the music playing? Yeah. Here we go. So we'll start here. Go on. This is good. Keep it going.
Life is the name of the game, and I want to play
the game with you. Life can be terribly tame if you don't play the game with you.
This is good, keep going.
Life is to go as you please, and I'd be so pleased to go with you. Life can be oh such a tease if you don't play the game with you.
Last one. 20 seconds, working pair. Remember. And time up. There's your time. It's gone. Mark yourself. See how you got on. There's the information that you'll need. Give you a few seconds just to study it. Now, I'm going to interrupt here and I'll apologise. Time is short, so we need to keep the pace moving. The question is, what just happened? And the answer was, I wanted to show you how when you have to think, you instantly become smarter. So when I gave you the picture and the word, and you read it out loud, your brain didn't have to do anything. It's mental, it went on autopilot that all the information was done for you, so it just washed over you. But when I obscured the image, or I removed it completely and you read it out loud, your brain had to respond and create the image or fill in the gaps in your mind. So what we know is that if we were doing this under strict lab conditions, most people remember the images in gold, which were the ones that were either obscured or weren't there in the first place. Because your brain instantly goes to the muscle that you've just worked out. So the essence of this point is, you do not need to be the expert. What you do need to be expert in is creating an environment where people feel safe and trust you enough to ask questions in the first place. Which brings us to the third part of our acronym here, which is this. I've yet to meet an elite coach that doesn't possess elite levels of emotional intelligence. Now, I'm conscious that emotional intelligence is a term that gets used an awful lot, especially in the corporate world, without there necessarily being much substance to explain what does that mean. So if I may, what I would like to do is I would like to tell you a story about the most emotionally intelligent coach I met in this research. And then I will go into a bit of the detail of the psychology of what made him so successful and so special. So let me explain that when I was doing this, I was really keen to go out to Detroit because there was an environment there that I regard it as one of the world's best learning environments in any world that I visited in any industry. But I don't know if you've been to Detroit in the last decade or so, but the experience can be quite dispiriting. The whole city is built on the car industry, and as the car industry has gone into decline, the recession has bit Detroit deeper than most other American cities. So in 2011, it declared itself as the first American city to be bankrupt. And you appreciate that in certain parts of America, the poor become poorer than others. And Detroit, that seems to have been very much the case. But where I was needing to visit was the poorest part of Detroit. So I'm not going to dress it up, I'm not going to over-glamorise it, but some of the experiences that I went through on my visit were quite intimidating and quite frightening on occasions. Just in terms of the evidence of the guns, the gangs, the drugs, it was more evident than many other places. And there was a couple of occasions where I found myself a little bit out of my depth, but certainly feeling pretty scared and intimidated. Because I stood out for two reasons. One, the colour of my skin, and secondly, my accent. So being a white English guy walking around some of these neighbourhoods made me an object of curiosity. But I was going to, it was a boxing gym in the district. It's very famous. It's known as the Kronk Boxing Gym. And the reason it intrigued me was this gym had a track record of 30 world champions in a 25-year period. Now, forget the sport. No other one environment had produced such a consistent level of success. So when I went to visit it, the driver that dropped me off outside the gym, just as I got out of the car, he pointed out that just above the handrail, as I walked up the stairs, there was bullet holes that just riddled my route to the top. So that just seemed to exacerbate the feelings I had of feeling a little bit intimidated and incredibly nervous. But the guy that was waiting for me at the top of the stairs was a coach called Emmanuel Stewart. And when I reached the top, he was waiting for me and he said, "Damian," he said, "it's great to see you this morning." He said, "Thank you for coming into my world." He said, how do you feel being here?" And I thought he was asking me a polite question, which deserved a polite response. So I gave him one. I said, "Manny, it's a real pleasure to meet you. I'm really excited to be here. It's been something I've been looking forward to for a long time." What he did next was fascinating. He said to me, "That's really kind. I appreciate such kind words." He said, "Now, would you tell me the truth? How do you really feel?" And the next thing was, I found myself just with verbal diarrhea, just talking and not knowing how to shut up. I said to him, "If I'm honest, I'm frightened. I feel out of my depth. I want to go home. And I know you're busy. I don't want to waste your time." And I just carried on talking. And it was how he handled it that was a mark of the man's esteem that I held him in. He said to me, "Thank you for being honest with me." He said, "That means me and you can now do some really good work together." And he put his arm on my shoulder and he said, "You stay with me. I'm going to look after you from now on." Now, when I got to know him a little bit better, I went back to this very first visit and I said to him, "That first morning I met you," I said, "why did you ask me the second question?" He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "You asked me a question, how did I feel? And I gave you an answer. Why did you feel the need to ask me the question again?" And he said to me, "I always ask the second question." He said, "You should always ask the second question." He said, "If you're going to coach somebody, that second question is when you actually start coaching them." I said, "Can you explain your methodology?" And he said, "Yeah, sure." He said, "When you walked up those stairs," he said, "let me explain to you the evidence that I have to hand." He said, "You're a white English guy coming in to an all-black neighbourhood in downtown Detroit." He said, "I know that you've experienced things that you probably don't see in Europe. The guns, the drugs, the gangs are a bit more evident than what you're probably used to." He said, "So when you walk up those stairs, my first question, how do you feel, is a legitimate question." He said, "And the answer that you gave me, that you said you're excited and you were looking forward to be here, leads me to one of two conclusions." He said, "You are either a liar or you're a sociopath." He said, "And I need to know, who am I now going to be working with?" So my second question moves the conversation so much quicker. So when I said, "How do you really feel?" the answer that you gave me on the second time told me that you were a liar. He said, "And you were lying to be socially polite. So that also leads me to a conclusion that you're probably a decent guy." He said, "So which is why I said, we can now work together." Because his logic was this. He said, every child that comes up those same stairs, the same journey that you've done on, feels the same way you do. They're nervous, they're frightened, they're a little bit intimidated, they don't want to be exposed or feel vulnerable. He said, "And I think I'm the best coach in the world, but I also work on the basis that I can't coach you if those emotions are clouding your judgment." Now, Manny Stewart is probably the least educated man I've ever met in my life, and I say that with real affection. But what I would say on the flip side is he's the most street smart by a million miles. He's never heard the term emotional intelligence, I'm confident of it. But he's lived it for over 40 years of his career with the success to bear it out. And he summed up emotional intelligence in 3 simple words that I think lie at the heart of all great coaches. He said, when we work together, I work on the basis that I need to contain, then explain. Contain, then explain. He said, if you get it in that order, people will jump through hoops for you. He said, but what I see so commonly happening in the world is people are too eager to explain, then contain. And it doesn't work in that particular configuration. So the question is, what does that mean? Because hopefully that phrase sticks in your mind, but there's a more legitimate question. How does that apply to me? Well, to explain that, let me take you on a detour into the world of evolutionary psychology, because this is where I spend a lot of my consultancy work. So let me give you an example. When I work on the coaching staff for some of the teams that I work on, the coaches that I work with take care of three areas. physical, tactical, and technical. So say with some of the football coaches that I might work on the staff with, their job, they often feel, is get the players fit, make sure they have the right skills, and then give them a game plan to go and win the game. My job is to deal with the fourth pillar, which is psychological. There's no point in being fit and having the skills and a game plan if when you come under pressure, you can't cope. So my job is to deal with that fourth pillar. And the way I do it is I explain, in evolutionary psychology terms, two thinking systems that are relevant. And to make it easy for the players, I talk about the red and the blue systems, because if you colour code it, it just allows them to be able to understand it. Let me explain it in very quick, simple terms. The red system is the limbic system, and it's the part of the brain that we share with every other species on the planet. So the question is, what does it do? The answer is it gives us three very strong drivers. The first driver is it gives us a sex drive, a desire to reproduce and to continue the life cycle. The second system, though, is it gives us the ability to stay alive. Now, when we sense that we're under a threat, whether this is from a predator that might physically kill us, through to a new way of working, a new coaching system, a new set of skills, a new methodology that you're introducing to your world, the limbic system kicks in. And when it senses that we don't have the skills to cope with what you're teaching me, the red system hijacks us and gives us three very simple responses. Run away, hide, or go and confront the danger. You know the response better as the freeze, flight, or fight response. Now, the way this manifests itself in the corporate world becomes really quite fascinating. If you're working with a team that has a high absence rate, where people are often claiming to be sick or unavailable or absent on a frequent basis, you've got a red flight response happening. People don't feel safe where they are, so they're running away. Think about it when you were a child at school. When you used to go into the classroom for a lesson that you didn't like, and the teacher would allow you to sit wherever you wanted to, where was your preferred position in the classroom? As far back as you possibly can. So it's a flight response that you try and evade contact with that particular individual. So now that we're spending time in each other's company this afternoon, what are some of the behavioural mannerisms that I'm looking for as I'm speaking to you? I'm looking for those of you that may be still on your phone. I'm looking for those of you just having a private conversation with the person you sat next to. Those of you that are looking distracted out there. Because what that would tell me is, physically you're in the room, but mentally you've left it. And I know that our ability to engage with each other becomes severely diminished by the fact that mentally you've left. The second response that you get, I hear a lot of coaches tell me this, their biggest frustration with their teams is they describe it as apathy. They say we do Q&A sessions, we don't get any responses. We've got suggestion schemes for what we could do better, we don't get any answers back. But when people leave the room, they have lots of things to say for themselves. As we demonstrated in that last section on thinking, my answer to those leaders would be the same that I would say to you. If when you're asking a question all you're receiving is silence, that same silence should be deafening you, because you're receiving feedback, and the feedback is they don't feel safe or they don't trust you. So instead, they've gone freeze mode, say nothing, don't ask any questions, just keep your head down, just nod along. The third response you get is aggression, cynicism, rudeness, abrasiveness, people being horrible, people being underhand in the way that they ask a question or looking to score points off each other. Do you ever recognise those kind of responses? That's quite simply the fight mode. That's people giving off an air of menace that says, don't challenge me, don't challenge my status, my bite might be worse than my bark, and they just try to warn you off getting too close or too challenging. Now, any evidence of those behaviours is a predictor of long-term underperformance, because when the red system is taking hold, you cannot sustain. You occasionally deliver high performance, that's true, but that's like telling me that a broken clock is right. It's an accident, it's not a design. The third factor that you get from the red system, though, is we're pack animals by our nature. Now, what this means is that one of our earliest evolutionary lessons was don't hunt on your own. because you will be killed by wandering off separate from the group. So a survival skill is to learn to identify with a tribe or a gang or a group that's bigger than you, which is part of the reason this conference is so important, because it creates that sense of solidarity or esprit de corps. Now this helps us explain religion right the way through to Facebook and all the other variants in between. It isn't a problem, but where it becomes a problem is when these people divide themselves up into tribes or to cliques or divisions. Now in the corporate world, I often get people to apply a really simple barometer as to whether they're hearing this kind of pack instinct kick in. Do you ever hear people talk about levels of management or certain departments in less than flattering terms? They might describe the senior management as being hopeless. They might describe a certain department as being useless. Do you ever hear those conversations? If you want to know whether those conversations are acceptable, apply a really simple test. Transfer the level of management or the department for race or gender and see how long they would last in your business. If people were talking about women or people of an ethnic type in that same way, the answer is they'd be sacked by the end of the day. True? So why does it become acceptable to speak in the same terms about a department or a level of management? The answer is it's not. But what your redhead is doing is you're seeking to dehumanize another group of people. And if you can dehumanize them, that allows you far easier to delete, distort, or dismiss any messages that they give you, because they're not like you. They don't feel the same as you. They don't perceive the world in the same way you do. So when the red system kicks in, what I often see is that when coaches, poor coaches, try to deal with it, they use fear, facts, or force to try to make the change happen. They just bombard you with stats of why it's worth doing. They either try and frighten you that if you don't do it, we won't exist in 5 years' time, or they just try to pull rank and tell you that you need to do it because they've decided it's the best option. And every one of those responses just exacerbates red thinking. In contrast, the blue system is the prefrontal cortex of your brain. And this part of your brain has got two agendas. The first one is it's driven by logic and common sense. Part of the way we can explain this is if you have a look at why conspiracy theories abound. When people are confronted with random chaotic events, they make up stories instead to help them navigate it. The second way that we do it is we have a society agenda, which is at the heart of coaching. Coaches want to get you to understand that we can both win if we invest in this relationship. So that's a very simple, very quick route through what emotional intelligence is. The question is, if it's so obvious, why is it so infrequently applied? And the answer is because those two systems, the red and blue system, are not two equal systems. I'll prove it to you. What we know is the red system is on average 5 times faster than the blue system. And I'll give you a quick exercise to illustrate. I'm going to put some information up here on the screen. Now there is a problem with the information that I've given you. Put your hand up when you spot what the problem is. This should take you 2 seconds to recognise it. So don't shout the answer out, just put your hand up to indicate that you've spotted the problem. See how long it takes you. So 2 seconds have gone. Ten seconds have now gone. $20 seconds have now gone, right? So we're starting to get there. Does anyone want to shout out what the issue is?
W.
Why did it take you so long to spot something so obvious?
First looking at the red.
Your redhead kicked in and got distracted by the bright, shiny numbers. Did you recognise it? See how this works. So our job, when we talk about that phrase, contain, then explain, this goes back to the principle. You need to contain the red system. And you do that by convincing them that you care about them. You take an interest in the individual. You invest in their success. You make them feel that they belong in your world. When all those aspects can start to happen, The red system gets out of the way, and that's where genuine coaching work can then start to interact with the blue system instead. Which brings us then to the fourth element of this. So we talk about the red emotional intelligence. We'll skip through that bit and we'll get to this bit. This is the simplest aspect of it. This is about stripping our language of jargon. Let me explain. One of my academic heroes is a man called Howard Gardner. He's an educational psychologist at Harvard. And Howard Gardner argues that the education systems around the world that we have in place often fail the vast majority of the children that will take part in it. Because when a child leaves school, when they reach sort of late adolescence and they leave the school system, the question society tends to ask of them is, how clever are you? So what are the exam results that you achieved? What qualifications have you just garnered to your name? And Gardner argues that's the wrong question we should be asking any child. The question we should be in the habit of asking them is not how clever are you, but how are you clever? Because he argues that we're all intelligent, but we just have different intelligences. Some children might be socially gifted, some of us might be verbally gifted, some of us might be physically gifted, some of us might be musically gifted. But if we only test for a very narrow band, how many children feel stupid having left school, when the real challenge is we just haven't engaged them at their own level of intellect? Now, the reason I explain this is that everybody is intelligent in some way, but what none of us is intelligent at is corporate bullshit. So don't speak it. When you hear people say we have a silo mentality in our business, we need to work with synergy so we can execute the strategy, let me be the one to tell you that nobody understands what you've just said, right? Nobody gets that way of thinking. I'll show you how your thinking systems work instead. We'll do a thought exercise. So just indulge me if you will. I want you all to conjure up in your head an image of Paris. So just think of the capital of France and what that looks like in your mind, if you will. Just go and visit Paris and just have a quick look at it. Now, I want you to stay in Paris and I want you to go and have a look at the Mona Lisa. So go and see her enigmatic smile staring back at you in your mind's eye. Now you've done that, I would like you to imagine holding in your hand a juicy, succulent orange. So I want you to feel the waxy texture of the rind, maybe smell it, maybe imagine taking a segment and the tang of it as it hits the back of your mouth. Good. Now, I want you to hear the first line of the Beatles song, Hey Jude. Right, so it's Paul McCartney singing the opening bars to Hey Jude. Just hear him singing now in your head. Nice, thank you. Finally, I want you all to come up with your definition of justice. Let me explain to you where your brain just took you, right? So when I said to you, come up with your, go and have a look at Paris, you all responded with an image somewhere that included something like that. Then I said, go and have a look at the Mona Lisa, and you could immediately recognise what she looks like. Then I said, hold, smell and taste a juicy, succulent orange, and your response was immediate. Then I asked you to listen to Paul McCartney. And there he was, singing in the back of your head. But where did your brain go to, though, when I asked you to come up with your definition of justice?
There's no common ground.
I'd lost most people. Yeah. Some of you saw maybe the courts in Belgium. Some of you maybe saw the Old Bailey. Some of you saw a miscarriage of justice. Some of you thought of something from your own childhood. But suddenly, because I threw in an abstract term, your brain had to reach out and find something it could hook onto. So now we're all speaking a different language. So when we use jargon, we have to understand that often we're isolating the vast majority of people in our room. What makes sense to us isn't necessarily what translates. So this was a simple but powerful lesson I saw these coaches do. One coach said to me, if I've got the option of speaking to a group of experts, but I recognise there's some novices in the room, I speak at the language of the amateur, not at the professional. And that way, we ensure that we have some common ground. Now, I did an exercise. I got some funding at the University in Manchester a few years ago to do an exercise to illustrate this point. There was a British comedian about 10 years ago that used to do this as a for humour. But he would play song lyrics to the audience and he would make up like funny equivalents of what the lyrics actually were. But it's a great illustration of how when your brain doesn't understand the information being shared, it makes up ridiculous equivalents instead. So to illustrate this to some of the coaches I was working with, we got funding to do an exercise with 20 15-year-old boys from inner city Manchester, where we sat them in a room and we played the music and they had to write down what they thought the singer was saying. Would you like to see the best 3 responses we got off these kids? Yes. So the first one we did was, thank you for that enthusiastic response. Cheers. You can come again, I'll take you everywhere with me, right? Okay. The first one was, we played them, there's a Welsh singer, Duffy, singing a song. The song she's singing is Mercy. This is what the kids thought she was singing.
You got me begging you for mercy.
Now we thought, these kids are not listening to that singer, so we played them instead Britney Spears. We thought this was a contemporary issue, so we played them Britney. This is what they thought Britney was singing.
My loneliness is killing me.
My favourite example, and this is just about to ruin the childhoods of a vast number of you in the room, we played them Ray Parker Jr. singing the theme song to Ghostbusters. This is what they thought he was singing.
Who you gonna call?
Listen again, it makes perfect sense.
Who you gonna call?
Your childhood has gone, sorry, right? So the essence of this point is what Einstein told us. If you can't explain simply as if you're talking to a 6-year-old child, you probably don't understand the point well enough yourself. And this is the message that we need to understand. This isn't about assuming people are stupid, it's the opposite. People are smart. Your job is just to make sure your language is accessible. Which brings us to the final one of our points here, which is this. This is about the power of storytelling. What I found a common attribute from these coaches was that they were fantastic at telling stories. Now I'll give you a story that happened to me that relates to this, that when I was doing the research for this book. I was doing some work in a school in Manchester, in the north of England. We have an issue there that some of our schools exist in real poverty, so financially very difficult conditions. And I will often go and work with some of these schools to look at just some ways around it. And I was doing some work in a school with where the children are not guaranteed to get 3 meals a day. And the impact that that has is physiological rather than anything else. But these children, their blood sugar levels tend to be erratic. And what we know is that when your blood sugars dip below a certain threshold, your ability to concentrate and engage becomes physiologically impossible. You can't do it even if you had the best of intentions. So this is a long way of explaining how I found myself one afternoon sat in a classroom of a teacher running a lesson for 5-year-old children. And we were talking about this challenge, and she said, I've got an idea. She said, I'm going to introduce this story time for the kids. So at 2:30 every afternoon, the children just sit on a mat, and an adult comes and just reads them a story. So she said to me, would you like to be today's very first reader? We're going to trial this as an exercise. Would you like to read a story to the children? Now I felt honoured, and I said, yes, of course, I'd love to do this. So she gathered the kids around me, and I was sat on a chair, and the book she put in my hand to read to these children was the story, The 3 Little Pigs. Are you familiar with this? Right. It might be a long time since you've read it. It was the same for me. It was 35 years since I'd seen this story, but it's the same version, right? That much was true. So I decided that what I was going to do was, because it was the first time of reading of these kids having this as an exercise, I was going to set the bar as high as possible. So I thought, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the characters in different voices and really throw myself into it and be enthusiastic for them. So I decided that when I did the pigs, I did a high-pitched, squeaky voice that I won't demonstrate, don't worry. But when I did the wolf, I did my growliest, biggest, baddest voice I could. Now, do you remember the bit in the story when the wolf hunts the pigs down and they all run into different houses? Yeah? Well, when we get to that stage of the story, I don't know about the children, but I was loving it, right? I was really enjoying myself. So I'm reading the story and I said, the wolf came running over the top of the hills and the pigs could see him coming, and the pigs knew he was angry, so they all ran to their different houses, and the wolf saw the houses that they'd run into, and he was getting angrier and angrier. So he went round to the door of each house and he started banging on it, and he said to the pigs, he said, if you don't come out this house now, I'm going to huff, and I'm going to puff, and I'm going to blow your house down. And this one little boy sat next to me. He looked up at me and he said, you bastard. It's still the best feedback I have ever got. Because what it demonstrated in that moment was that he was learning, he was engaged. If you, like, the language wasn't acceptable, I understand that. But at that moment, he was engaged. He really thought I was the big bad wolf at that time. So you get an idea of this is how powerful storytelling can be. Because it taps into a concept in our psychology that's referred to as the Kolmogorov complexity. Don't worry about the name, it's after a Russian psychologist, but A.M. Forster used to demonstrate it. When people used to go to A.M. Forster 100 years ago and say, how do I tell a story? I want to write a book. He would say, I will give you 2 sentences. Which one of these 2 sentences do you think you will remember? Sentence number 1, the king died, then the queen died. Or sentence number 2, the king died, and then the queen died of a broken heart. Which one of those 2 sentences do you remember, 1 or 2? 2. But there's more information contained in that. There's a Kolmogorov complexity. It works because there's a story, so your brain naturally remembers more of that information. Now the question is, how do we, not about the impact of storytelling, because we all intuitively know that, I'm assuming. The question is, how do we tell great stories? In the nature of the work we do, how do we engage? And the answer is, evidence is all around us of how we tell stories. The most compelling way are what these guys have been teaching us for the last 25 years. I'm going to assume that you've all seen at least one Pixar film during the last quarter of a century. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah.
So, in the words of John Lasseter and Ed Catmull, the guys behind Pixar, why are they successful? Their answer is because they're the world's best storytellers. And they've actually codified it and come up with a methodology of how you consistently tell brilliant stories. Let me show you what it is. So we start with the bluff. Do you remember the bluff, the bottom line up front? Do you know what the bluff was for Finding Nemo? It's a father and son love story involving fish. Now I've got you interested, you say, tell me the story then. That's intriguing. What's the story? Every Pixar film can be told using 6 sentences. If you start every story you tell using these 6 sentences, I will show you where psychologically it's the most robust method you will get of teaching. Once upon a time, there was a daddy fish and his son fish who lived on a coral reef. The dad had been widowed, and in his grief, he used to worry about his son getting into trouble. So every day, he used to instruct his son not to go to the edge of the coral reef, because that was where trouble lay. The son used to ignore his dad, and every day, he used to think his dad was complaining. So one day, he ignored him and went to the coral reef where he wasn't supposed to go. Whilst he was there, he got into trouble, and he was captured by divers and taken to a fish tank just outside of Sydney in Australia. Because of that, the father had to confront his deepest, darkest fears and go out into the ocean, which terrified him, in a desperate attempt to try to rescue his son and to save his life. Because of that, his son came to recognise that his dad wasn't over-controlling, he just loved him more than anything else in the bottom of the ocean. Finally, after a whole series of adventures, father and son reunited, where they go back to the coral reef and live happily ever after. There's Finding Nemo for you in 6 simple sentences. Now, why does it work? Well, if you look at it, they contain every one of the steps. We start by telling you we're going to tell you a story. So we start with the simple message, what's the film about? Then we say, let me tell you a story about what this film really involves. Your brain opens up. Then we establish a pattern of behaviour that we break here. So now we make you think because you don't know how this problem is going to be solved. Why is because of that mentioned twice? Because the redhead is 5 times more powerful than the blue. So we need to give it enough reasons to care. And then we tie it all together in a final conclusion. Let me tell you a story about why you're here. You know, every year you've come along. Let me tell you a story about the Scrum conference this year. Most years you come along and you just decide that you'll sit and you'll just listen when it suits you, but you're here to network. One year you decide that you're really going to come along and engage and learn. Because of that, you pick up some techniques you can use to apply in your own business. Because of that, your clients recognise that you're at the leading edge of thinking out there in the industry until finally you're incredibly successful. I'm making this up. Now you imagine what you can do with your knowledge, your wisdom and your expertise if you were to apply this same methodology in your world. So the point I want to make is there's no formula when it comes to engaging, but there is almost a mental inventory. If engagement isn't happening, if learning isn't happening in your world, I'd like you to be able to say, is my message simple? Am I creating space for people to think? Am I demonstrating emotional intelligence and containing then explaining? Have I stripped my language of jargon and have I got some stories to illustrate my point? And if you can answer yes to as many of those challenges as possible, what I hope this session is giving you a sense of confidence is that psychologically you're getting people in the space where real learning and engagement can happen. Which brings me back to that coffee cup I showed you. Because I told you it took me 2 years of research to go back to my very first interview and recognise just how subtle but profound it was when it came to engagement. Because I showed you the picture that I drew and I handed it back to the coach I described, Freddie Roach. And when he looked at it, he nodded and said, 99% of people draw the picture in the same way you do. And I said, okay, but what was the purpose of it? He said, you asked me, how do I manage to engage these people from very different backgrounds? Your question about my Parkinson's illness and how I've overcome that, to do that, starts from the assumption that what I'm trying to do is tell them what's in my head. And he said, but the coffee cup shows you that that's not my methodology, because I don't draw it like that. He said, I draw the coffee cup like that. I start from trying to work out what's in your head and then work backwards from there. Not from the perspective of seeing the world through my eyes and telling you how it should be. I try to understand how is it in your world that I can help to add and complement it. And you have that same challenge here, not only today but beyond here. Are you going to walk out of this room with the view that you held before you came in? Or are you prepared to engage and see the world from a slightly different perspective? Let me show you a challenge of what I mean by that. Let me give you a summary of my session. My point has been this: you've got to engage the heart and then the head if you're going to inspire change. You might come back and tell me that, let me tell you, I believe that this stuff on the psychology of engagement is effectively nonsense. You might tell me that I don't believe that what I say does really matter or that my words can have a positive impact on other people. I believe this, that I'll never be able to have people instantly recall my words. So I'm afraid I just don't accept that this steps process you've been outlining will allow me to deliver my messages in creative, innovative or original ways. Instead, years from now, I've no doubt that I'll be listening to the same old messages to try to improve my ability to engage with others. And there's no way that people will come to look with envy at my talent for communication and engagement. That's absurd. I believe that I'll probably be seen as slow and out of touch eventually. And as for the very idea that my ability to connect with others will make me be perceived as unique, that's just spin. Let's face it, what I have to say can never really inspire people. And it's just not true to say that everywhere there are plenty of opportunities we can learn how to do this. Let's face it, most people don't care about connecting with others. And it's foolish to keep thinking that there are reasons to believe in the psychology of engagement. Well, as I said, that's just one perspective. That's drawing the coffee cup from one angle. That's walking in and seeing the world the same way that you walk out with. What I hope you're going to walk out of the next 2 days saying is a different message. I hope you walk out saying this. There are reasons to believe in the psychology of engagement, and it's foolish to keep thinking that most people don't care about connecting with others. Everywhere there's plenty of opportunities to learn how to do this, and it's just not true to say that what you have to say can never really go and inspire people. That's just spin. My ability to connect with others will make me be seen as unique, and as for the idea that I'll probably be seen as slow and out of touch, that's absurd. I believe that people will come to look with envy at my talent for communication, and there's no way that years from now I'll still be listening to the same old tired messages to try to improve my ability to engage. Instead, this steps process will allow me to deliver my messages in creative, innovative and highly original ways. So I just don't accept that I'll never be able to have people instantly recall my words. Instead, I believe this, that what I say does really matter and that my words can have a positive impact on others. I don't believe that this stuff on the psychology of engagement is nonsense. I hope you're walking out of the next 2 days saying that, let me tell you that I do believe you have to engage the heart and then the head if we really are going to inspire change within our own community. Thanks for listening.
Damian, thank you so much. That was inspiring, right? Yes. That's the kind of yes that you made them say. That's amazing. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I presume there are plenty of questions. I don't know, Chem, if you could mute the screen briefly. So we can, right, perfect, so we can stand around here. Oh, there are plenty of questions, I presume, and there are emotions that you'd like to share. Also, some feedback is welcome. Positive emotions, negative emotions, so long as there are some emotions there. Yeah. Any feedback or questions that you have? Yes, from the very back. I'll run you away so everyone can hear us in the live stream. All the people that were shouting yes in front of their computer. There we go.
Hi, my name is Rick, and you say that's important that you first contain and then explain. And I tried to find a proper translation in German for contain, but there are so many translations of contain. Maybe you can explain a little bit more what you mean with contain, that I can find the right translation in German.
Sure, okay, yeah. So, well, thanks for clarifying it, because I am conscious that your English is far better than my German, so thank you for trying to meet me halfway at least. Contain is, there's effectively three things that containment means. What the red system of your thinking needs is, we need to belong, so we need to feel we're on the same team as each other. The second thing I need to feel is safe and valued. So that point I said about I need to feel that I've got something that's worth saying and I'm not going to be made to feel stupid when I say it. The third thing I need to have is control. I need to have some control over the relationship. This isn't just you telling me. I need to feel that I can share my opinion and that I can decide what we're doing as well. So to explain it, it was a nice phrase in Detroit that I got, but the evidence is there's a lot more that underpins it, and it's those three things: control, belonging, and safety. That's what contain really does mean. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for your question. Thanks for clarifying.
Has anyone found a good translation already? It's nice how it works in English, right? You have the two C's.
Yeah, sure.
That connect it. So it's one of those nice things that work verbally very well in one language, but then they don't in another.
Yeah,
thank you for clarifying. Any further questions, inputs, feedbacks? Anyone that hasn't felt this happy in the last 2 decades? That was a nice feedback. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Any questions that you've got? The man's here. Yes.
Hey, mate.
It was very interesting, but my question is, this technique I can use to do positive things. I can use as well to do negative things. And when he was talking, speaking, I recall some of the techniques were very similar to the one in the past fascists or dictators used to manipulate people. So how can we protect ourselves?
Oh, right, okay. Wow, that's
Thank you.
yeah, no, it's
You did not
really
expect
interesting
that,
point.
right?
I've never reflected on it from that perspective, so it's interesting. Yes, I think we get caught up in assuming that like generations are different, and the conditioning of generations are certainly very different in terms of the new generation that have grown up online. So the way that they perceive the world is different, but we have far many things in common than there are differences. And the software that we're describing here about psychologically how you can engage people is consistent and has been for the last 30,000 years, at least on our evolutionary journey. So you're right, there have been occasions where that's been used with ill intent rather than for good intent. I think the thinking part of it is a large bit of it, to make sure that we're constantly vigilant that those techniques are being used for what we would describe as the right reasons. The reason I hesitate as well, though, is that I often find that when we divide the world into good versus bad, good reasons versus bad reasons, it just helps it's an unhelpful narrative. I prefer the language, is it helpful or unhelpful? Are your reasons helpful or are they unhelpful? And because then that takes away the pejorative statement of that's good or that's bad. It's neither. It's just helpful or unhelpful. So, yeah, you're right, they can be applied for unhelpful reasons as well as for helpful reasons. We just need to be vigilant, I suppose, but how we counter it, I'm not sure. I've never really stopped and reflected on that. But thanks for making me think. Thank you. Cheers.
So the same techniques then can be used for good or bad. It's just techniques. They don't necessarily have a positive or negative connotation to
Yeah, so the context I was looking at was...
And how you use them, right?
Yes.
So when your second question was like, can I use those techniques also to do bad things? Yes, you can. But that's your choice and your ethics.
Yeah. Good luck.
Is this on?
Yeah, the mic should be on. We'll just open it up right now.
Okay, is it on now? No, it's not. Is it on now?
I'll repeat your question.
yeah,
You can
go
just ask it like that.
Okay, so my question is your red and blue system referring to the same thing that Daniel Kahneman is describing as System 1 and System 2?
Yeah, kind of. So Kahneman's System 1 and 2 is entirely... So the reason So I like Kahneman's stuff as well. So the answer is yes, it is. It's effectively System 1 and System 2. There are loads of metaphors out there for understanding our brain. So there's things like the chimp brain, the elephant brain. John Haidt wrote about the elephant and the rider brain. There's the Sherlock Holmes brain. There's lots of brilliant metaphors out there. And I think that what I often see when I share that is the metaphors can be confusing for people, and I say the reality is they're all using the same system, they're all describing the same system, they're just using metaphors. So, but the reason I just colour code it as opposed to use metaphors is when I've worked predominantly with athletes, they often use it to excuse poor behaviour. So they detach themselves and they say, it's not me, it's my monkey. When the reality is it's almost like they try to disown what they've done as if it was nothing to do with them. So I think colour coding it just makes it a lot more you have to be more responsible for it. But yeah, Kahneman's stuff is very similar as well. Yeah, there's nothing new in any of this stuff, it's just metaphors. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Question answered. Thank you so much. And I think you're going to get another huge round of applause.
Oh, listen, thank you.
Damian
Thanks for
Hughes.
listening. Yes, thank you.